Trust Alliance, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the 2014 Email Integrity Audit. Joining me on the call today is Mike Jones, Director of Product Management from Agari. I also want to thank many of our members who were active participants in this research for their help and assistance and guidance. So thank you very much. This webinar will be recorded and available later today for download from the OTA website. So we're going to get started now. And again, encourage you to submit your questions on the question pane. So as we advance the slides here, I'd like to walk through a very quick overview of what we're going to share here, a little bit of the background of this report, the top-level findings from our scorecard, our highlights, and then we're going to have a deep discussion of the results of the top sites' implementation of DKIM or SPF, or DKIM and SPF. And then we're going to talk about subdomains, the importance of DMARC, TLS, and some best practices. So we have a lot to cover in this next hour, but again, focusing now on the next slide, talking on the honor roll. For those of you who may be aware, in June we released our annual online trust audit and honor roll. We evaluated 800 websites in multiple sectors, and sites got up to 100 points in each category. Including brand protection, security, and privacy. The core or the focus of the brand protection has been the email authentication. This report, in this next slide, really is focusing on the elements of brand protection, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So next slide here. And I think it's important why we care. A lot of us are very close to email authentication and the standards over the past 10 years. But what we think is extremely important for domain holders and brand owners to recognize the importance of SPF, DKIM, and DMARC across all of their mail streams. And we think the benefits are threefold. First, and perhaps most important, is the protection of consumers from receiving the malicious and fraudulent email. As a result of that, we believe brands will have improved brand protection. And third, but not least, is improved deliverability of legitimate email into users' inbox. And clearly we've seen leaders such as Google and Yahoo and Microsoft really promoting the importance of these. So I think that's the top level points we want to focus on. In the next slide, I think again, this is that baseline of the three technologies. And I know many of the people on the call here are experts in this area, but again, the whole point here is SPF and DKIM very much complement each other in the technologies and of how mail goes from a client to servers back to the recipient's mailbox. And again, we believe that combined, DKIM and SPF really is a great combination of resiliency for authenticating mail. And Mike, do you have any comments on this and what you've seen? You've been involved in this since the early days of AOL.
No comments other than just to support the statements and the slide that, I mean, in my experience over the years, this has been proven over and over again that when sending domains use SPF and DKIM, and especially now DMARC, and look at the data about SPF and DKIM, they can achieve 100% or near 100% authentication rates on their legitimate email streams.
Great. And one point here, someone just sent me a message here. This slide does need to get updated. We're working on that right now to actually have an illustration and build on here on how DMARC builds into here. But this is the overview. And again, any folks on the call that would like more deep down information, they can visit the site or feel free to give us a call and we can help provide you some additional tutorials and materials. So that's the overview. As we move forward, you know, we released a report last week, and what was really striking is the number of brands talking about the value to their brand and to their company and to their customers here. And so again, Sal Trippi, again, talking about how it's blocking thousands of messages on a daily basis and how it's really helping their brand. And again, as a major email marketer, Publishers Clearinghouse has been a leader in this area, and not only doing their subdomains, but actively pushing their service providers and their own operations to be authenticating the top-level domain as well. So moving forward, want to share what we have, and we introduced last week what we call the Email Trust Scorecard. As I mentioned, this is a subset of the analysis we did for the honor roll. But we looked at here the focus of SPF and DKIM at the top level domain and DMARC. And what we're showing here, combined of over the 800 sites, only 8.3% of these leading brands, this is the top 100 banks, the top 500 e-commerce sites, top news and media sites, only 8.3% are really taking this holistic approach at their top level domain. And perhaps the highest, obviously, is 28% of the social. So conversely, 91.7% we do not believe are really adequately protecting consumers from the fraudulent mails that are targeting and coming from the top level domain. Now, one nuance here, and then I'd like to get Mike's comments here, is we're including DMARC in this scenario, and even if DMARC has a P equals none or a no action, I would expect in future years to pass the scorecard, you'd have to have a DMARC at an R, reject, or Q for quarantine, which we'll discuss later. Mike, have you had any experience with brand owners and the top level domains here, and why we may see such a low level when we hear in the news that there's such high adoption by the email marketing community?
Well, typically the most common reason where we would see a brand that does not have a full authentication implementation at their top level domain or their most recognizable brand domain, but they have it at one or more subdomains, is that they outsource some of their email for marketing purposes or other things, and the third party or a number of third parties sending mail on their behalf actually authenticate those subdomains that they're responsible for, but the organization hasn't thought through the process of implementing authentication at their primary domain, the domain that's most recognizable to a consumer and is a nice target for phishers.
Right. I think, and by the way, we're going to go in the following slides, we're going to be digging down the data and a much more granular review of the subdomains versus top-level domains. So let's go to the next slide here. Again, Twitter. Many of you know Josh, an OTA member. They've seen significant impact here. So throughout our white paper, you're going to see testimonials from other leading brands of the importance of DMARC. And again, when we're talking about DMARC, it's really the foundation being built on top of SPF and DKIM. So another great testimonial of the business value. Let's talk about the highlights of our report. As I mentioned, only 8.3% of consumer-facing brands have implemented, and we see that as a concerning at the highest level. On the positive side, we're actually seeing great growth of SPF and DKIM across all sectors. And that's not necessarily just the top-level domain, but subdomains here. So we're seeing the internet retailers, the top 100, showing some great growth here into implementation of both. As mentioned earlier, SPF and DKIM adoption is growing primarily at the delegated subdomains. And from a brand protection perspective, we're very concerned that we're not crossing the chasm to the other groups here. DMARC, again, we have growth, but we have to put it in perspective. It's just 2 years, and it's just going to IETF. And I want to give a shout out to Tim Dragan, a longtime supporter of OTA, who has now stepped up to, as I understand, co-chair the IETF working committee. And I think as we see DMARC go through the IETF process and have an RFC, it also should support the inbound and the appliance market to adopt DMARC in the inbound. So we're looking forward to see that growth here. Let's kind of move forward here and kind of go forward 2 slides and talk about a little bit more of the details of here. So this slide, again, graphically is looking at sectors, and I think the most important one is both. And what's interesting here is, again, the internet retailers at 88%, as mentioned in the previous slide, is adopting. Concerning is the banks, the top 100 banks. Less than half are implementing both, and we've seen some great champions out there. Those you may know Vic from JP Morgan Chase has done a great job and a leader in this space here. But we're still seeing over half the banks who are often targeted haven't implemented both. And this is both at either the top level or the sub-level domain here. So very concerning. And fast forward to DMARC, where a lot of us have been high-fiving ourselves. Any form of DMARC, again, the top banks, less than a quarter, 21%. So we think there's a big upside here as we go through the analysis and talking about this. So let's look at some trends here. And we've been tracking, as many of you know, over 5 years we've been tracking both DKIM and SPF. And so again, this is an examination of any form of DKIM on any domain or SPF. One thing that we've done this year is not only have we relied on data being provided by Agari, Microsoft, ReturnPath, and some others, we also signed up for newsletters for every internet retailer site, and we also have, where possible, we've signed up or we've sent an email discussion to the FDIC banks. And the reason we did this is we want to be 100% sure we were having a sampling and able to observe mail, and specifically for the DKIM analysis here. So obviously in this slide, we're reaching max of adoption in the retailers, and so they recognize the value. But the challenge as we go down forward, you'll see that we're missing at the top level domain. So next slide is the both here. And again, this is on, you saw the bar chart before, and this again gives you the trend. So again, if you look at the top 500 e-commerce sites in this last year, going from 56% to 74%. And so this is really positive news. It's also very positive that the marketing communities are really doing a much better job on the subdomains. Unfortunately, we see the banks are flat. No change at all whatsoever from last year, as well as the federal. So I think those inform what the slide is telling us. Those that are involved are seeing the value clearly in the email deliverability side here. So let's go a little deeper here and into the discussion of subdomains. And this is where, Mike, I think you might have some good experience here. We chose here for simplicity, again, to focus on just 2014. And again, what you're seeing is 3 slides. Did we find any SPF versus top-level domain? And so in most cases, SPF has been implemented at the top-level domain. We don't see that much variance. But we do see, for example, some that are only doing a subdomain and not the top level, and that's why you see any SPF being a higher number. Any comments on this slide, Mike, or do you want to maybe, why would companies not be doing SPF at the top-level domain?
Well, it's similar to my comment before. Usually when we see a company who's not doing any type of authentication at their primary domain, or their highest top-level brand domain, but some subdomains are, it's usually because the company itself is not controlling those subdomains. They have a third party who's doing it for them. And another situation is the company just simply doesn't use their top-level domain for email, so they overlook the fact that it's still necessary to protect that domain against others using it for email, others who they don't want using it. So some businesses will go ahead and take care of their primary email sending domains that are under their control, which are subdomains, but their top-level domain is only used for their website or something like that. They don't send email from it, so they don't think about the fact that they still should publish an SPF record for that domain, and they should publish an SPF record that tells the world that we don't send mail from this domain. And they should still publish a DMARC record for that top-level domain with a reject policy, which is telling the world we don't send mail from this domain. If you get mail saying it's from this domain, please don't accept it and send me information about it. So it's really important that companies start to understand that even domains that you don't send mail from, if that happens to be your top-level domain, it's still worth protecting and publishing the proper records.
Right. Actually, we just got a question, a great question that was asked here, is what do we define as a top-level domain? And so we're calling what we call a top-level domain is what the website would resolve to, the homepage of the website. So a good example would be Sears.com, whereas they have multiple subdomains, email.sears.com, e-mail, and different variations of that. So it's what the consumer is most recognizable and what the website that they would be interfacing with. And so that's what we consider the top level or top level brand domain.
We should be clear that terminology-wise, it's not the typical definition of a top-level domain. It's more like, for our purposes here, the top-level domain is that, like the parent organizational domain for a brand, the brand that's most recognizable, the domain that's most recognizable of the brand that they probably use for their website and such.
Exactly. Let's, so we see the variation here in SPF. We dig down a little deeper into subdomains, into DKIM in the next slide here. And one of the things that was of concern is the variance here. And not only that, is the inconsistency. One of the things that we were very surprised is we had specific subdomains that we were seeing signing one day and not signing the next day. Or upwards of 90% of mail coming from specific subdomain was not being signed. So that really introduced another variable here. But if you go to the next slide real quick, we have a build here that talks. I thought we had. Actually, this slide's fine here, and go to the build here of the subdomain analysis here, and go one more slide. Oops. Well, kind of. So on this slide here, we're seeing the subdomains between DKIM, a fair amount of a disconnect. As we mentioned that the email marketers for the internet retailers are doing a great job in the subdomains of 85%, but the top level, we're only seeing DKIM at 33%. So a huge disconnect, much larger than in SPF. And some of this is attributed to that the entities are able to delegate the subdomains which have signing capabilities through their ESP, and their internal corporate infrastructure, which again resolves back to their top level domain or brand domain, what we call, does not have the ability to support DKIM. So we see that exist in a lot of corporate MTAs, and that's part of the reason that we're seeing a disconnect here. But again, some significant variances. Again, when we're talking about maximum protection, this is a big opportunity here. Any questions, comments on that, Mike? I think we've kind of beat the horse a little bit. We have seen some positive trends on here. For example, the internet retailers last year was at 26% adoption at the top level for DKIM, and increased to 33%. So we are seeing positive movement in most cases. The top 500 increased almost over 9% as well. Where we're seeing some fall off is we don't quite understand it with the banks actually dropped slightly this past year. So that's an area of concern. And our own members have increased a fair amount as well. So we're going to be tracking this further. And again, one of the things it also identified in speaking with several ESPs is there is some inconsistency on the outbound mail servers configurations at times that may have a contributing factor why some subdomains are being authenticated some days and not the other. And Mike, I mean, I was surprised. I mean, sometimes we saw only a handful of percentage of mail being signed from some of the subdomains. So go to the next slide. And so we're talking about DMARC adoption. And again, a lot of our members have been really very instrumental in the growth of DMARC. we've talked about this a few times. Clearly, the growth of having any type of DMARC record is very, very positive here. There's a lot of conflicting data, though, on DMARC. You see reports that come out, and they talk about the number of million mailboxes are being protected via DMARC, and that's really basically based on consumer ISPs using a DMARC record. What we aren't seeing is actually the mail streams here, and clearly of the brands that have adopted. So this is a rather concerning element, and we actually, the way we validate this, a question just came up, is we look for a DMARC record in the DNS zone file for that respective domain. So some great growth, but again, a threefold growth in the top 100 domains over commerce sites, double in Internet 500. And we have great hopes to see this go forward. Mike, DMARC is such a simple thing to do. It's a simple text record. What do you think? Why do you think that the numbers are still so low for these top consumer sites?
I think for the most part, organizations or brands that aren't doing DMARC yet, it's simply a matter of education and the newness of DMARC. So of course the numbers for 2012 are very low because it was only publicly introduced at the beginning of 2012. So DMARC is a relatively young specification in email, and the adoption for that short period of time is fairly remarkable, but there's still a lot of education to be done with DMARC, and I think the fact that the IETF working group for DMARC is being spun up now is going to be a great help, because there is always some number of people who say, well, it doesn't have an RFC yet, so I'm not going to do it. But that said, DMARC is a very stable specification at this point. You mentioned the consumer mailbox providers who are checking DMARC and honoring DMARC policies and sending DMARC data back to the senders. If you tell most brand owners that, hey, just by publishing this simple text record, you're going to get data about your email back from Gmail, Yahoo, AOL, Comcast, Hotmail, Outlook.com, all these places that are doing DMARC, you would think most people would be jumping at that opportunity. So I think once the right people at these brands and companies get the message, it's not hard to convince them to do DMARC, because as you said, it's very simple. You don't have to do SPF and DKIM first. You don't have to spend a lot of money. You just have to publish a text record and start seeing what the data looks like.
Yeah, I think that's a key point. Some of you may have attended the Internet Retail Conference, and where we released the data, and we sat down with probably 24 large retailers, and they were not aware of DMARC, and these were people that were in the email, had email responsibility. And so it really reminded me that we're still preaching to the choir at times, and to get beyond that, to get them. And really, when I outlined the benefits that you talked about, Mike, understanding your mail streams, and just getting a handle around that, we had no resistance whatsoever of someone getting records. And even prior to our honor roll coming out, dozens of companies reached out to us. They wanted to make sure they made the honor roll. Had low awareness, but again, once we explained that and walked them through, so I'd suggest that while it is still an early standard, it's not a standard yet, but I don't believe the IETF status has impacted for brands. It may be impacting on inbound appliances and MTAs and such, of them updating their software, but putting a record up there, I suggest, is strictly a matter of knowledge and getting the message out there. And that's part of our goal here for OTAs, to help communicate that value. So let's look at the next slide. And I mentioned the reject or quarantine. So we're trying to look at this here. And this slide can be a little confusing. But as we look at the percent of entities having a record, and then the percent of those records being a reject or quarantine. So again, if you look in the 2014 15% of the internet retailers publish a DMARC record. Of that 15%, 40% of those had to reject or quarantine. And so as the number of records go up, it is possible that rejection quarantine may decline because early adopters, or I should say more recent adopters, are more prone to have a policy of none versus committing to reject or quarantine. And that's kind of represented in the social sector, where it went from 22% having a DMARC record last year to 36%. But the percentage went down, and that's reflected because that 50% is the 18 this year that had a reject or quarantine. So hopefully that provides a little clarity. So we expect over time, through the testing of sites and then sites being able to really monitor and get a handle on their mail streams, to have a better handle on this. So hopefully that's kind of clarification. Mike, do you have, you work with hundreds of customers as well as members such as ReturnPath and such. What is your recommendation on implementing a reject or quarantine?
My recommendation is absolutely start with a policy of none, and gather data and analyze the data and understand what is happening with your mail streams first. And then once you've done that, then you have a lot of guidance on what your next steps are. If you have a domain or a set of domains that you believe you don't send email from, publish the policy of P equals none and collect data for those domains, and just verify the fact that there is no legitimate email coming from them. I have seen multiple times domain or companies that believe they have domains that don't send legitimate email, and when they publish their DMARC record, they actually find there is some small amount of legitimate email coming from that domain. And then they can make a decision: is the group that's sending email from that domain acting properly? Should they be corrected, or should we not consider that a non-email sending domain anymore? So you can adjust whatever is right for your business, but always look at the data first, do the analysis. If you have email sending domains that you thought you were authenticating all the mail streams, you might find some that you missed. You might find some third parties you didn't know about, and then you can get all that stuff in order and then move to the reject or quarantine policy when it's appropriate for your business. And every business has different standards for what is an acceptable authentication rate, or what's the acceptable risk in possibly rejecting legitimate mail that fails authentication. So that's a decision that every business and for every domain they have to make by analyzing the data.
So Mike, what about, does DMARC help if I have an SPF record and I'm missing an IP address, or a range is wrong, or a DMARC record that perhaps the key's wrong or an error? Does that provide me data back in those areas as well?
Absolutely. Your DMARC aggregate data is going to show all mail that is purporting to be from the domain that you publish that record for, and that means the use of that domain in the header from field of the email. So if you missed an IP address or range in your SPF record, you're going to see messages in your DMARC data failing SPF coming from those IP addresses, and if you analyze that data and realize that I actually own that IP address that's coming from my infrastructure, I need to add that to my SPF record. Or, oh, that SPF, that range looks like a third party that we're using. I need to include that third party in my SPF record. And same thing with DKIM. You will see that messages are failing DKIM, and you can see the source of those messages and understand if you need to go check your infrastructure there and see why that's failing DKIM.
Well, what's interesting is that I think we're really identifying the value proposition of DMARC. It's providing very clear direction to receiving parties, ISPs, on how to handle mail. But the second one that you mentioned was also providing ability for you to monitor mail streams. And third, and perhaps as important as anything else, is to manage fails. You certainly, if mail is failing, you want to if legitimate mail is found due to a mistake on your end, it provides the ability to effectively just in time or as quick as possible to update those records, which will ultimately improve mail deliverability. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, the more receivers see consistent authenticated mail streams from a domain, the better that reputation is going to be, and the better, what we've seen is the better deliverability for legitimate messages. And it's a continuous monitoring process as well. Even after you've published your DMARC record with the P equals none policy, and you've done all the work to upgrade your infrastructure and get everything the way you want it, and moved over to a quarantine or reject policy, you keep getting that DMARC data every day, and you keep analyzing the data. You look for changes because mistakes happen. So once you're at a quarantine or reject policy, you certainly want to catch those mistakes as soon as possible so that legitimate mail doesn't continue to be rejected.
Well, as we know firsthand, for OTA, mistakes do happen, and we've made some, revamped our outbound mail servers and other things, and we recently came across that very thing, is that we were signing the mail, but the key was, I believe, was wrong, and so we had a fail as a result of that, and that was a good example. Reviewing the DMARC report was able to flag that that day, and we were able to make that fix. So again, obviously, we had some mail that failed. And even in the P equals none. So I think it's just things do change, and as Mike mentioned, the continuous monitoring of this. So we have some other questions. We'll go through a few more slides here, but I think again what we try to show is the status of DKIM and SPF, the importance of it not just being in the subdomains, but the real opportunity is at the top level domain. And I think part of that challenge is in our report we say it's a disconnect, but it's a disconnect of who owns that. We talk to the IT departments and they say, well, it's not an IT issue. Our mail infrastructure is secure. The marketing department says, well, you know, we're not mailing from that top level domain, so it's not a marketing issue. And you know, so it's really this combined effort. Is it IT? Is it operations? And that's that heavy bar. How do we get that message out to them, to those companies, that this is brand protection? You mentioned earlier, it's not only the, you know, it may be a domain that doesn't send any mail. I know there's many people working on the issue of park domains. Again, a similar scenario, a mail that doesn't have any, you should be publishing a DMARC record against that. You may not have a DKIM because you're not signing mail. But you certainly can have an SPF record that instructs that no mail comes to that domain. So those are key areas. And I think the other area that we talked about in the report is not a continuous monitoring of your own domains, but also monitoring of lookalike domains that may be created that may end up sending mail. So again, the brand protection part is really a challenge, and I would challenge the attendees on the call is to share with us, you know, how can you get a more holistic view of what's happening and to get these records published. So let's kind of, one other point that we want to talk about is in complementary, as we talk about email integrity. We talk about SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, but there's another major area that's also evolving here in the next slide, is TLS. And we're now seeing TLS really gaining quite a bit of traction, and transport layer security. TLS has been around for some time, and it's really encrypting mail in transit from one client to another, trying to address the problem of it really being a plain text message. Banks have adopted TLS for some time and been a best practice that have been promoted by the Financial Services Roundtable. But right now, as a result of the NSA and other efforts out there, we're seeing a great level of adoption by Google, Yahoo, as well as Microsoft, and moving forward. So I think we're going to see more of this, and our future versions of the report card will start to monitor mail streams that are using what we call opportunistic TLS. So again, we'll be evaluating that in the next year's honor roll comment area. Mike, have you had much interest, or have you been hearing much on the TLS front?
So I don't have a lot of insights into TLS. That's not my primary area of expertise for sure, but as you mentioned, it is gaining a lot of traction out there. I'm sure everyone's read some of the information posted by Gmail, Yahoo, Facebook. Had a really nice post recently about their efforts in using TLS to protect the email that they send. So yeah, the adoption is and the momentum is certainly great right now.
Yeah, I think on that point, just this week, Google announced that they're going to give favorable rankings to sites that have adopted always-on SSL, and that's really about securing the browser session between sites. And there's discussion I'm hearing behind closed doors that, again, going forward, you might start to see positive ranking or weighting on email marketing messages that are TLS. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but I think that's certainly something, and I would encourage those email marketers and service providers to be thinking about how to also implement TLS. So again, TLS, what is important, it's the privacy element of the email. And again, it is certainly complementary to SPF and DKIM and DMARC. So I'll be looking forward to that as it evolves going forward. So I think there's some lessons learned, and I think, Mike, you mentioned a few of them. Maybe you could walk through these again and any other comments you've observed.
Sure. So I'm pretty sure we've touched on all these lessons learned throughout the presentation, but just to reiterate them. So the first one, bullet on the slide here, is talking about the dynamic mailing environment, and this is true for pretty much every customer implementation I've seen that we've worked with. I mean, organizations are always changing, so you can never really consider yourself done with email authentication, which is why DMARC is so great, because you can actually do that continuous monitoring. You're going to get data every day about your domains that you've published DMARC records for, and you can monitor those. You can set up alerts to alert on changes. You can set up reports to see daily, weekly, monthly reports on the effectiveness of your DMARC policies and your authentication infrastructure. So it's a great tool for having some visibility and insight into that dynamic environment. The next bullet about operational discipline is absolutely true. I mean, every organization that I've seen that has been really successful has been with email authentication has been successful because as they're implementing DMARC and the authentication technologies, they are putting rules in place that they stick to throughout their organization about how this is how we do email, and all email that comes from our organization must follow these rules, and in order to make that work, there has to be a lot of discipline involved in making that stick. Craig, you mentioned earlier about sometimes ownership is an issue between operations, marketing, IT, security, like who owns this whole effort. And some organizations do have an owner of this, other organizations don't have an owner necessarily, but if you don't have an owner, then it requires a lot of cooperation between those different departments. But the bottom line is the organization overall has to realize that it is about their brand and about their brand being protected. So no matter which group is the owner, all of these different groups have to buy into the fact that this is important and protecting the brand is important. And testing and monitoring, I think, goes along with the first couple points, where that's part of the operational discipline and monitoring your dynamic mailing environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And one point I just want to reiterate here is that one of the next things that the fallout from this is we're going to be soliciting best practices for another white paper on what are those best practices to get the different teams working together and how to kind of move this from the subdomains that are being managed by the marketing side to a broader view of companies. So we certainly welcome anyone to contact us in this area, because I think by publishing that, we can help cross that. And clearly, part of this is communicating what the value the business value and the technical value and the importance of brand protection in these different areas. So let's kind of walk through, and then we have some time to open up some questions here. We've pulled together roughly 8 specific recommendations, somewhat overlapping. One, I think we've talked very clearly, again, the importance of taking a look at all your email channels and all your domains. Your top levels, what we're calling your subdomains, your park domains, which is important. As one of our members, Mike Cameras, pointed out, this is a key area. A lot of times a domain be acquired for a brand. It may not even be used yet. Are we authenticating in those areas? Are we considering that? And domains that will never send mail. So it's all those areas, and there may even be another category. Mike really emphasized the importance of SPF and DKIM combined. In our training, we talk about this quite a bit. They help address some of the use cases such as mail forwarding and mailing lists. It's not 100% perfect, but it is very comprehensive. And again, the third point again, DMARC. Mike, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. You know, start out with monitor, obtain feedback, review your reports. There are companies and service providers that can actually help in that area as well. But eventually, you know, move to a reject or quarantine policy. And there's many sites that are doing that. And going forward, we are certainly going to be putting increased weight on those companies that do that. So those are the 3 on this slide. The next slide, again, inbound authentication. As we're seeing more and more businesses and users being impacted at their workplace through their non-consumer ISP mail, we have more concerns. This is a concern also in the government employees. And as we found a few years ago with a lot of the email marketers being compromised, it was really through spear phishing. If we think about what happened with Target, it was an employee at a HVAC vendor that fell for a spoof email. So it's very important. And this is the area that we need a lot of help from the industry. We're still not seeing the implementation in the inbound checking to the level it should be. And it's not just for DMARC, but also combined SPF and DKIM as well. Again, we mentioned earlier reject policies for park domains that kind of overlaps. One of the first ones, monitoring the mail flow. And one of the issues is DKIM key rotation SPF records. Mike, can you talk a little bit more about key rotation? I think we talked about that a little bit.
Sure. I mean, DKIM is based off of the public key infrastructure, so it's important for the security of your DKIM keys that they be rotated on a regular basis. There's recommendations out there about how frequently to do that, and that depends largely on the size of the key, which there's also recommendations for a safe key size as well, which is generally you never want to have a DKIM key that's smaller than 1024 bits, and 2048 is more the secure recommendation right now. And you want to rotate your keys probably at least every 6 months, if not every quarter. But key rotation does incur some risk, and that is if you're signing with an old key that then has been revoked because a key's been rotated out, then you could start seeing mail fail DKIM, which is why you have to continuously monitor these things to catch instances like that.
So a question Mike was asked is, why should I rotate that? Is there a risk that the keys are being compromised? What's the importance of the rotation? What value does it provide for us? So again, the question really is there a risk? What is the technical reason why I should be rotating my keys? Any comments on that, Mike?
I'm sorry, Craig, I thought I unmuted, but apparently I didn't. So the reason for rotating keys is all about security. You don't want your keys to be cracked, and it's possible for someone to go with enough computing resources and time to crack a key. Now, of course, if you have a 2048-bit key, it's probably not that easy to be cracked. Even a 1024-bit key would be tough. But there have been instances in the last couple of years of keys smaller than 1024 bits that have actually been broken by people with access to reasonable amounts of computing resources in reasonable amounts of time. So that's why the key size recommendations are what they are, but key rotation is just a good security practice.
Oh, great. I think that's a key point there. So we can obviously take some, we'll open the mic up in just a minute here for some of the other questions that are coming through, and I appreciate the input for you. What I was going to say is that we mentioned the last 2 points here is implement opportunistic TLS. And so again, opportunistic TLS is really where TLS only works with the receiving party and the sending party are supporting it. And the good news today from the email marketing community is we have broad support of the leading consumer mailbox provider, so certainly something to consider. Another question came up. TLS does not encrypt the mail from a perspective of once it's on a client machine, anyone has access to that client machine. It's really about that mail in transit. And certainly if others have some comments on that as well. And the last point is monitor domain registrations for lookalike domains. And this was added last week right before we released the report because email authentication is helping spoofing mail that appears to be coming from your domain or a delegated subdomain. We also have similar aspects of where cyber criminals are acquiring a domain that looks very similar. It may have some typos in it for I's versus L's or zeros versus O's that the consumer, when looking at that mail, may very quickly think it's coming from the right domain, your brand. So it's important that if you're looking at this from a holistic brand protection perspective, not only are you authenticating and monitor your own mail streams and using DMARC to see any that may be actually failing, it's also important to, at the same time, concurrently be looking at any domains that are sending mail that may be compromising yourself. So want to make sure you have that. The report talks in this a little more detail, and there's certainly additional resources we have available. Speaking of resources, we can go to the next slide, and then again, encourage anyone to raise their hand in the speakers, and we'll take you off the mic. I do remind you that the webinar is still being recorded, so any of your comments will be shared here. But this is a summary of the resources. I encourage you to go to the OTA site. We have a lot of this information up there today where I think you'll find it. If there are other resources, we want to hear from you. One, we have all the charts here that you can download and use. We do ask for attribution back to OTA, but we do want to make this available. We do have testimonials, and again, if you know of others that want to be added to that, this is great. It's great for your brands, but it also helps us advance it. So when companies say, well, geez, who else is doing it? We can point them to a single place and perhaps the most comprehensive listing of companies that are adopting SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. So encourage you to look at that. So those are top